The morning sun rose over the Sahel with a steady, determined heat not yet fierce, but insistent. It warmed the rust-colored sand and stirred the air, still thick with the cool of night. In the town of Walata, a quiet hum began to settle over the winding alleys and packed mud homes as salt traders prepared for a long journey northward. You might imagine that the men and women of 15th-century West Africa who dealt in salt lived lives of constant motion, caravans, trade, and risk, but the truth is more mundane. There were rituals to observe, donkeys to feed, and most importantly, food to pack. It is here, in the slow beginning of a desert journey, that we begin. Salt, a currency and a curse. To understand why anyone would pack salted goat meat, dried dates, and cracked millet for a 3-week trek into the Sahara, you must understand that salt was not a seasoning, it was wealth. In the 15th century, salt from the mines of Tagheza in the central Sahara was traded almost ounce for ounce with gold. This wasn't hyperbole or exaggeration. People literally used slabs of salt as currency. Salt preserved meat, treated wounds, and critically balanced the body in desert heat, when water was scarce and sweat was constant. Entire cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Walata owed their prosperity to the trade networks built on this white mineral. The traders knew this, and so did their stomachs. The morning routine of a trader. Before any caravan departed, there was a pattern to follow. A caravan might consist of 30 to 100 camels, each led by a handler who also bore personal supplies. You, a junior trader or assistant on this journey, would rise before the sun fully kissed the town's thatched rooftops. First, tea. Not the kind brewed in porcelain, but bitter, dark leaves steeped in hot water poured from a battered brass kettle, passed among the handlers. This was often accompanied by millet porridge, thick and bland, sweetened with a spoon of date syrup if one was lucky. This meal was eaten in silence, sitting on woven reed mats under the rising sun. Next came the preparation of provisions not just for you, but for the animals. Camels required specific types of dried fodder that wouldn't rot in heat, and the handlers often argued over how much was too much to carry. And then there was your lunch. Lunch packed with dust and intention. Lunch for a salt trader wasn't eaten at noon, not really. The sun at that hour was so unforgiving that travel ceased, and shelter was sought beneath makeshift tents made from camel hides. It was during these pauses that you might unwrap your midday meal. The lunch of a West African salt trader was, above all else, practical. It had to survive weeks of heat, sandstorms, and the constant jostle of motion. Typical rations included dried goat meat, salted heavily and stored in woven grass wrappings. This meat was chewy, occasionally tough, but brimming with protein and salt, perfect for the desert. Millet cakes, which were dense, flat, and had the consistency of damp cornbread. They could be eaten cold or warmed over a fire. Cracked baobab seed snacks, astringent and slightly sour, often chewed slowly. Dried dates, imported from the oases, high in sugar and energy. Fermented cheese or curds wrapped in leaves, not always pleasant smelling, but rich in fat. Water, of course, was life. Leather gourds sealed with beeswax held the day's supply. Traders often had to ration even the act of swallowing, learning to chew on dried grains just to stimulate saliva. Packing the food, art of preservation. The materials used to wrap food were as important as the food itself. Grass-woven satchels, leather pouches, and pottery jars, for those who could afford the weight, were common. Sand was the enemy, and so most food was double-wrapped, once in fiber and once more in leather or animal skin. Beeswax coatings were often used to make the interiors of gourds or flasks more hygienic. In some cases, the traders carried salted fat, a mixture of goat tallow and salt, which could be used to fry millet cakes or as a spread, dense, oily, but packed with energy. The role of women in lunch. Though most salt traders were men, the role of women in preparing their journeys was significant and often overlooked. Women prepared most of the food in advance, preserved meats, dried fruits, and packed them. They also brewed herbal tonics meant to fight fatigue or settle desert-induced nausea. Recipes weren't written, they were remembered. Passed down from mother to daughter, these preservation techniques were quietly revolutionary. A good batch of millet cakes could mean the difference between finishing the trek with strength or falling behind. Some women, especially in wealthy trading towns like Timbuktu, even specialized in preparing rations for large caravans, turning a domestic skill into a thriving enterprise. The caravan departs. After the morning bustle, you and your fellow traders would move out. The camels lined up in uneven columns, their shadows stretching long behind them. Your lunch sat in a small pouch near your hip, tied tightly with string. There would be many hours before you'd eat it, and by then the sun would be high and the world a sea of golden dust. And yet one can't help but wonder, was the food even appetizing by then? Did the dried goat meat still carry flavor after 2 weeks? Did anyone ever tire of millet cakes? That question, perhaps, can only be answered by chewing slowly under a tattered hide in the Sahara heat. The sand was hot by mid-morning, already shimmering in uneven waves across the horizon. The camels, called ships of the desert not out of poetry but necessity, plodded forward without complaint, their padded feet unfazed by the shifting terrain. The caravan moved not as a single line, but as a quiet, snaking rhythm through the dunes, always forward, never fast. As you ride along, hip bumping against the familiar clink of your lunch pouch, you begin to notice the routine that governs everything. This is not the journey of a few days. It's a matter of weeks, and within that time, you come to understand that salt trade was not just about salt, it was about surviving the boredom, the heat, and the unrelenting stillness. The caravan system, more than just camels. By the 15th century, the trans-Saharan salt trade was a highly organized machine. Caravans were not ad hoc gatherings of wanderers. They were orchestrated with precise social and logistical structure. Each caravan had a caravan leader, or azawad, responsible for the route, discipline, and pace. Food and water masters, who kept track of dwindling rations and sought out known oases. Scribes in the larger caravans, who documented transactions and payments. Guards and scouts, sometimes armed, to handle potential bandits or misdirection. Spiritual leaders, or griots, who offered oral recitations or protection prayers at dawn and dusk. The caravan would often begin walking in the early hours, rest during the heat, and walk again in the late afternoon and evening. It is during these rest periods that lunch took center stage, not just as sustenance, but as ceremony. Eating in the desert, a ritual of stillness. The act of eating was rarely communal in the desert. While food was sometimes shared, especially when a pouch tore open or meat spoiled, most traders kept their meals private. You might see someone squatting behind a small rock outcropping, quietly chewing dried goat meat. Another might unwrap millet cakes, revealing traces of sand even in their innermost layers. The desert had a way of getting into everything. Some traders, especially the veterans, ate with methodical care, chewing each bite 30 or 40 times to stimulate digestion and maximize hydration. Others, less patient, bit quickly, only to complain later of dry mouths or headaches. And yet, even in this quiet time, the food reflected culture, memory, and home. A certain dried curd might remind someone of a village festival. A mixture of baobab seed and honey might carry the whisper of a childhood meal. These were not just rations, they were links to identity. Desert foods, regional variations, and specialties. Though there was a general staple diet, the specific meals carried varied by region and background. Tuareg traders, known for their nomadic resilience, preferred dried camel meat, sometimes smoked, and a fermented yogurt called takai. Their cheese was packed in leather pouches and coated with ash to preserve it. Soninke and Mande traders from more agrarian southern regions brought boiled yam paste, sun-dried and rolled into dense balls. They also packed leaf-wrapped nut loaves made from crushed kola or shea seeds. Hausa traders, who often acted as intermediaries, were known for bringing along spiced bean cakes, which retained their flavor even after days in the sun. In many cases, spices were rare but cherished. A small pouch of dried chili or ginger powder could be sprinkled over millet cakes to break the monotony. These additions were often status symbols, quietly signaling a trader's wealth or connections. Water more valuable than salt. While salt was the cargo, water was the currency of the journey. A man might carry 2 days' worth of food, but he would guard a single gourd of water with absolute paranoia. Water was distributed based on strict measurements. Sometimes disputes would arise when someone took too many swallows. In one recorded case from the Tadmaka Chronicles, a fight broke out after a man dipped his cloth into the water to cool his neck, a wasteful luxury that nearly cost him his position in the caravan. Veteran traders developed methods to conserve water beyond rationing. Chewing small grains, like millet or dried baobab pulp, to stimulate saliva. Breathing slowly and through the nose to reduce water loss. Avoiding conversation, particularly during peak heat, to preserve moisture. And yet, even with care, dehydration was common. It manifested as cracked lips, hallucinations, or blackouts. Salt helped, ironically retaining water in the body, but only if balanced properly. Many traders had stories of companions who collapsed, only to be left behind with waterless flasks. It is said that the sound of someone uncorking a gourd was among the most respected and envied sounds of the midday halt. The unseen labor behind the food. You wouldn't know it just by chewing it, but the millet cake in your hand took days to prepare. The goat meat was not only dried but massaged with salt daily for a week before packing. The leaves used to wrap food were often heated over coals to make them more pliable, then coated with oil to repel dust. These processes were mostly invisible to the traders themselves. It was women mothers, wives, sisters, and market specialists who knew the fine balance between drying and rotting, wrapping and molding. Even in towns like Walata, where trade dominated the economy, food preservation was a domestic science with very real stakes. One misplaced batch could spoil an entire caravan's rations. Traders remembered the names of women who packed particularly long-lasting millet or goat that stayed chewable even after 20 days. Their reputation traveled, even if they themselves did not. Oases and meals that felt like feast. Reaching an oasis was more than a strategic stop. It was the closest thing to comfort a salt trader would find on the road. Here, if the caravan had permission or power, fresh food could be procured. Watermelons or other desert melons were prized and sliced with communal knives. Fresh goat milk was sometimes traded or bought, usually drunk in careful sips. Flatbread baked over coals might be purchased or shared among traders. Fresh dates, soft and sticky, replaced the dried, chalky ones in their packs. This break in the monotony could restore morale, replenish supplies, and allow for limited trade. It was also one of the few times cooking might occur if the caravan was staying overnight. Pounded millet might be stirred into a thick porridge with oil and spices, simmering quietly as the sun fell. Yet these moments were rare. For most of the journey, food remained what it always was, wrapped, dried, and swallowed with sand in your teeth. Trading salt for stories. While salt was exchanged for gold in the markets, along the route it was often traded informally for stories, songs, or gossip. At oases or resting points, traders met others going the opposite direction. In these moments, items like dried cheese, goat meat, or even fruit could be exchanged for news. This oral tradition was central to West African commerce. Griots and storytellers preserved histories, but the average trader also became a vector of information. Who had fallen ill? Which caravan had been raided? was the water at a certain well now bitter. And in this mix of storytelling and chewing, of listening and swallowing, the very fabric of trade was woven. But one might still wonder, what happened when food ran out? What if a caravan miscalculated its rations, or worse, encountered disaster mid-journey? What were the emergency measures the foods no one wanted to eat, but might be the difference between survival and vanishing into the dunes? The camel stumbled. It wasn't unusual sand shifts, hooves sink, but this one did not rise again. With its long neck folded into the sand and a quiet sigh escaping its nostrils, the animal remained still. The traders didn't panic. This was not the first casualty of the journey, nor would it be the last. What mattered now was redistribution, of goods, of water, and above all, of food. You are 18 days into the Salt Road. The heat has become more than discomfort. It's a form of pressure that squeezes the mind into silence. You no longer look forward to lunch. You look toward it because there is nothing else to do. And now, you watch as your fellow travelers silently open packs, weigh dried meat against cracked millet, and begin to calculate what remains. You do the same. When the rations dwindled, even the most experienced caravans occasionally misjudged their needs. A delay at an oasis, a lost camel, or an unexpected sandstorm could throw off the most precise food plans. In such cases, traders turned to secondary or reserve foods items specifically packed not for nutrition or taste, but survival. These included hard millet balls, almost stone-like, designed to last indefinitely. Soaked in water, they became edible barely. Dried camel blood cakes, prepared by certain Tuareg groups, rich in iron and protein but difficult to chew. Fat blocks, made from boiled goat or camel fat mixed with salt and ash, more fuel than food. Powdered baobab leaves, reconstituted with water or camel milk when available. These were the foods of desperation, eaten slowly, in silence. They filled the stomach, if not the soul. And sometimes even these ran out. The emergency, starvation, and strategy. When food failed entirely, the caravan had two options. Push to the next oasis, gambling on endurance. Kill a camel. This was not a decision made lightly. Camels were wealth, transportation, and survival all at once. But in moments of true desperation, a single animal might be sacrificed. The process was methodical. The meat was cut thin and dried immediately to prevent spoilage. The fat was rendered over a fire, if fuel could be found. The stomach lining and intestines were cleaned, boiled, and consumed first. Bones were cracked open for marrow rich in calories. Even blood was used, mixed with stored grains or millet flour to create a porridge of sorts. It was not unheard of to see traders licking their fingers clean of fat, knowing they might not eat again for 2 days. Illness and the limits of salt. Paradoxically, salt traders often faced sodium-related illnesses. Excess salt, when not balanced with water or potassium-rich foods, could lead to symptoms we now recognize as hypertension, muscle cramps, and hallucinations. Some caravans, particularly the better-funded ones, brought along dried banana or plantain chips, prepared in the humid south and traded north. Others carried herbal mixtures wrapped in cloth remedies for stomach pain, salt poisoning, or heat exhaustion. These were administered by designated medicine men, or by griots with knowledge of plants. But the average trader had no such luxuries. You recall, for instance, the older man who walked alongside you 2 days prior. His lips were white with salt. He hadn't spoken in a full day. And now he's lying under a low rock outcropping, his water gourd empty. You wonder if he has anything left in his pouch. Sometimes, survival was simply a matter of math. Ghost caravans, the ones that didn't make it. Every trader knew stories of caravans that vanished. Over time, the desert would bury all signs: tracks, bones, cargo. Occasionally, fragments were found in abandoned gourd, a sun-cracked leather pouch, even a stack of untouched salt blocks. These were called ghost caravans, and when encountered they were approached with reverence and caution. Sometimes food was found among the remnants, dried meat, still edible. Sometimes water sealed inside a forgotten jar. These discoveries were rare blessings, spoken of with awe during fireside rests. They reminded traders that the desert was not just vast, it was hungry. Reaching the end, the feast at the market. And yet most caravans did arrive, not because of luck, but because of planning, tradition, and endurance learned over generations. You finally reach Timbuktu, or perhaps Gao, or the salt market at Tagaza. Your pouch is nearly empty now, just a few crumbs of millet and the sticky remains of a date. But it doesn't matter. The stalls are full of food: lentil stews, flatbreads fresh from clay ovens, roasted goat, mango slices, nuts, beans, dried figs, and fermented sauces spiced with ginger. There is no rush to sell the salt. The first order of business is to eat. Meals at Journey's End are often exaggerated in the telling, but they are also simple: fresh bread, cool water, and warm food that doesn't come wrapped in woven grass. That alone is a form of wealth. The economics of lunch. And then trade begins. Your salt cut into slabs, carried for weeks, will buy gold, cloth, slaves, ivory, or manuscripts, depending on where you are. But rarely is food overlooked in this exchange. The caravans buy dried fruits, curds, grains, and herbs to bring home. Women in the market sell preserved ingredients for the next journey, already dried and wrapped, ready to endure. These women know what you've just endured. They understand what food must survive, and what taste matters after weeks of nothing but sand and salt. Lunch in this economy is a form of strategy. It determines who can make the return journey. It influences which caravans become legends and which disappear into the wind. Echoes in the present. Today, the salt caravans of the Sahara still exist, though fewer, and often more symbolic than commercial. Tuareg men still ride their camels into the desert, carrying slabs of salt cut from ancient mines. They still chew dried meat. They still ration their water with care. But the world has changed. Plastic containers have replaced leather gourds. Motorbikes sometimes follow the old tracks. Radios play music under stars where once there were only griots. And yet the meals, those quiet, sun-baked, patient meals, remain remarkably similar. In a world of instant delivery and packaged convenience, it is easy to forget that the act of preparing a lunch that would last 3 weeks in the desert was once a matter of generational expertise. It was a science, a survival skill, a cultural expression. And it raises one final, sleepy question. What rituals of survival, quiet, boring, forgotten, do we still carry forward today, without even realizing it? You're in the city of Rome, sometime in the 2nd century CE. The empire is at its height. Senators argue in marble halls, soldiers guard the frontiers, and aqueducts carry water across vast distances. The city hums with politics, power, and public spectacle. But not all of Rome is glamour. Beneath the surface, literally and figuratively, was an industry so essential and so invisible that few thought to write about it in detail: bread baking. And not the bread of emperors and feasts. This was the bread of dock workers, laborers, slaves, and scribes. The night shift bakers, covered in flour, sweating near clay ovens while most of the city slept, fed the belly of an empire. This is their story. Rome's 24-hour city. Rome never truly slept. Even at night, the streets echoed with wagon wheels, the shout of nightwatchmen, the mutter of travelers. Torches flickered against stone buildings and cats prowled for scraps. The reason: bread. The Roman population in the imperial period was vast, over 1 million people, possibly the largest city in the world at the time. Feeding this population required astonishing logistical effort, and bread was the cornerstone of the urban diet. Grain was imported by ship, often from Egypt and North Africa, arriving at the ports of Ostia and then carted inland. It had to be processed quickly, baked, and distributed in time for the morning crowds at tabernae, food stalls, and markets. And so baking happened at night. A baker's life, unseen, uncelebrated. To be a pister or Roman baker was a mixed fate. It offered steady work but little glory. Bakers were often freedmen, former slaves who had earned or been granted freedom, and their children might inherit the trade. It was skilled labor but humble. The typical Roman bakery, pistrinum, consisted of several distinct parts. A grinding room, where rotary millstones were turned by donkeys or slaves. A kneading area, with wide tables and deep bowls. The baking ovens called fornax, brick-lined, dome-shaped, and kept hot throughout the night. Storage for firewood, flour, water, and sometimes herbs or sweeteners. You, as a baker, began your shift in the late afternoon or early evening. The ovens had to be preheated, the flour milled, the dough prepared. By midnight, the actual baking was underway, and by dawn, the bread had to be ready for delivery. This was not a job for the lazy or the delicate. The air was filled with smoke, dust, and the constant itch of flour. The night shift schedule. Timekeeping in Rome wasn't exact, but the structure of the baker's night was surprisingly consistent. First hour post-sunset. Preheat the oven using dried pine or oak logs. Begin grinding grain into flour using donkey-powered millstones, the slow, rhythmic squeal echoing off the stone walls. Second and third hour. Mix flour with water and a sourdough starter, massa fermentata. Add salt and, if wealthy, honey, herbs, or dried fruit. Knead the dough by hand or foot. Yes, foot kneading was common, with bakers climbing into large troughs. Fourth hour, midnight. Begin shaping dough into various forms: round loaves, panis rotundus, flat cakes, or even ring-shaped breads. Mark them with house symbols or customer codes using carved wooden stamps. Fifth to sixth hour, pre-dawn, start baking. Ovens held heat well, but timing was everything. Some loaves needed only minutes, others required a slow bake. Batches were rotated constantly. Breaks were rare. Seventh hour, dawn. Bread is loaded into baskets or carts. Delivery boys and slaves take loaves to customers across the city. By sunrise, the bakery smells of ash and effort. You mop the sweat from your brow and prepare for brief sleep. This process repeated every single night. There were no weekends. Types of Roman bread. The modern image of Roman bread, dense, ringed loaves, is accurate but incomplete. In reality, bread came in many forms depending on class and region. Panis quadratus, the classic round loaf, often divided into 8 wedges, found preserved in Pompeii. Panis siligineus, made with fine white flour, consumed by the upper classes. Panis furfuraceus, rough, brown bread with bran, eaten by the poor. Libum, a sacrificial or ceremonial bread made with cheese and honey. Placenta, not what it sounds like, a layered flatbread similar to early baklava. Bread was often paired with olives, cheese, and diluted wine. It was rarely consumed alone. Safety, regulations, and the flour of the state. Roman bakeries operated under tight constraints. Because grain was such a critical commodity, grain supply and bread pricing were state-controlled. During the reign of Augustus, the annona system formalized the free or subsidized grain dole to citizens. Bakers who violated weight standards or price limits faced fines or even flogging. But the state also provided some protection. Bakers, guilds, collegia pistorum, were recognized by the imperial government and sometimes exempt from certain taxes. In exchange, bakers were required to meet city demands even during shortages. This tension made baking both a privileged and pressured profession. The hidden hazards of the job. Flour dust is flammable, so are pinewood ovens. Many bakeries were cramped, poorly ventilated, and prone to accidents. Burn scars were a common badge of the profession. Inscriptions and graffiti occasionally hint at bakers' injuries, such as a one-armed pister in a Pompeii wall carving, still managing the kneading trough with surprising efficiency. There were other risks too. Respiratory issues from flour inhalation, back problems from lifting sacks of grain, theft, especially of fresh bread from the carts before delivery, and perhaps most of all, exhaustion. A baker might sleep from mid-morning to early evening, missing most daylight hours. Their families adjusted around their odd rhythm. Children often learned the trade young, sleeping in flour sacks while their parents worked. The invisible heroes of morning. By the time the Roman public woke, stretched, and walked toward the tabernae, bread was already waiting. Warm, fragrant, stamped with the name of the bakery. Customers rarely saw the faces of the people who made it. The night shift bakers worked and slept in the shadows of Rome's grandeur, even as they made it possible. But you, on this imagined night in a flour-dusted pistrinum, have felt the weight of their labor, the repetition, the heat, the rhythmic patting of dough, the soreness in your arms. Still, one wonders, what happened when the grain ships were late? When firewood ran out? Or when the empire's appetite outpaced its ovens? It starts as a rumor always does. The grain ships from Alexandria are delayed. A storm or pirates or poor winds. No one knows for sure. But as a Roman baker on the night shift, you don't need confirmation. You can feel it in the marketplace by noon. Fewer sacks, tighter purses, more eyes watching your flour stores. And you've been here before. Rome may be mighty, but without its grain, the city grows anxious. Tempers fray. Bakers become targets, not for theft always, but for expectation. Let us now look at how Roman bakers navigated this invisible crisis, when the bread everyone expected could no longer be counted on. The grain dole, a city fed by bureaucracy. At the core of Roman bread production was the annona system, a state-run supply chain that distributed grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens. Under Augustus, nearly 200,000 adult males were eligible for the monthly grain ration. This grain, primarily wheat from Egypt and North Africa, arrived by ship to Portus or Ostia, Rome's harbors. From there, it was brought up the Tiber River and distributed through state granaries, horia, such as the Horia Galbi. Private bakeries like yours often relied on a mixture of state grain, if contracted, and private stockpiles. When the state shipments were late or disrupted, panic echoed down the food chain from port official to grain merchant, from merchant to baker, and finally from baker to customer. And in a city of 1 million mouths, even a 2-day delay could start a chain reaction. Coping strategies, stretching the dough. With grain tight, you must adapt. Overnight, the bakery's rhythm changes. You and your workers discuss quiet options, some clever, some desperate. Common adjustments included mixing flours. Barley or spelt could be added to stretch dwindling wheat supplies. This produced rougher, darker bread, considered less desirable but edible. Adding fillers, bran, ground legumes, even ground chestnuts or stale bread crumbs. These bulked up dough and made loaves appear fuller. Reducing loaf size, maintaining the same price and shape, but subtly lowering the weight hopping customers wouldn't notice. Rebaking stale loaves. Yesterday's bread might be warmed again, recrusted in a hot oven to mimic freshness. These techniques weren't illegal, but they were watched. State inspectors could measure loaves. Inscriptions from Pompeii show weights engraved on bread molds, indicating official standards. A baker caught cheating too openly might be fined. Or worse, they might lose the trust of their regulars, and in Rome's competitive marketplace, that could spell ruin. The social pressure of scarcity. When morning came, and bread stalls stood empty or had only rough loaves on display, the grumbling began. Bread was not just sustenance, it was a civic expectation. Romans, especially those receiving grain as part of their citizenship rights, felt entitled to their daily bread. Historical accounts describe bread riots erupting near marketplaces, stones thrown at bakery windows, petitions to the local magistrates blaming specific bakeries for hoarding. One night, you recall, your cousin's bakery was rushed by a hungry crowd. They didn't steal much, just broke the door and hurled accusations. He never reopened. It's not just about food, it's about order. Rome feared hunger not only for its physical toll, but because it unraveled social control. The Senate feared the mob. Emperors knew full well the phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Without one, the other could not soothe. Fire without flour, when the ovens went cold. For the baker, grain shortages brought another, stranger discomfort, emptiness. You still lit the oven each night, its habit, but with only a small batch to make, the once vibrant space felt hollow. No constant kneading, no rhythm of shaping loaves, no sweat in the air, no flour on every surface. The quiet was worse than the heat. Still, some bakeries tried to diversify. If they couldn't make wheat bread, they offered barley flatbreads with onions, hardtack biscuits for soldiers or travelers, simple porridges, cooked on site and sold warm by morning. These adaptations helped, but barely. Without grain, you were not a baker. You were simply a man with an oven and no purpose. When the state stepped in more serious shortages, the imperial administration intervened. Emperors from Augustus to Trajan implemented emergency grain distribution, drawing from reserve silos. Grain was prioritized too. The state bakers, military contractors, urban bakeries under guild contracts. These prioritized bakeries would receive measured grain deliveries, often escorted by guards. In return, they were required to produce a standard amount of bread daily. You knew bakers who worked under these contracts. They had better protection, yes, but far less freedom. Their nights were dictated by quotas and inspections. Failure meant immediate penalties. There was a bitter saying among the independent bakers: better to sleep in flour than under the emperor's thumb. But during shortages, that sentiment was tested. The human side of the crisis. One evening, you're visited by a woman young, with sunburned hands and a baby slung at her hip. She used to buy your bread every few days. "I know you're short," she says quietly. "Do you have anything left, even scraps?" You don't truly. But behind the kneading bench is a small jar of millet flour, not enough to sell, but enough to cook. You pour it into her cloth without a word. This is the part of the history books that rarely makes it in. The quiet choices, the scraps handed over, the nights you fed someone else before your own family. Graffiti, inscriptions, and the memory of shortages. Occasionally, traces of these crises surface in archaeology. A scratched wall near a bakery in Pompeii reads, "He gave us dust and called it bread." An inscription from Ostia commemorates a baker who fed the street during the year of thin harvests. Fragments of contracts between bakeries and curators Anani, grain officials, outline the exact grain amounts delivered during short months. These weren't the stories of heroes or generals. They were the records of those who kept the ovens lit when nothing else was burning. The return of grain and the quiet resumption. Eventually the ships came, the grain returned, loaves grew full again. There was no parade, just the quiet, rhythmic return to routine. The flour dust hung in the air once more. The donkey-powered millstones creaked back to life. The fire was lit earlier. The first loaves went into the oven with a sense of calm, familiar, dull, and comforting. You were a baker again. But in your heart, you now measured your wealth not in coins, but in flour sacks. And still, a question lingers as you pull a pannies quadratus from the hot oven. How long can a city survive on bread alone? And what happens when the city forgets who makes it? The fires have gone out for the night. The last loaves are cooling. You, a Roman baker of no particular fame, sit on a stool against the far wall of your pistrinum, your apron stiff with flour, your hands cracked and lined from years of dough and ash. Tonight felt ordinary, no shortages, no riots, no complaints. But as you listen to the coals crackle, a quieter truth settles in. Your work is both invisible and eternal. You've baked bread not just for the living, but for the dead, for ceremonies, for offerings, and for memory itself. This final chapter explores the overlooked role of bakers in religion, death, and the long, crumbling wake of the Roman Empire. Bread for the gods. Baking was not merely a commercial act in Roman society. Bread was sacred. In temples, flat cakes and sacrificial loaves were offered to the gods. These breads, often shaped in symbolic forms, were baked specifically for religious observances. Libum, a sacrificial cake made of flour and cheese, offered during private domestic rituals. Panis farius, a spelt-based wedding cake used in Roman marriages, symbolizing fertility and tradition. Placenta, a honeyed layered bread used in both ritual feasts and elite households. Bakers might be commissioned to produce these specialty loaves for feasts, funerals, or festivals. Though the recipes were ancient, the process was demanding careful measuring, decorative shaping, precise baking. This work didn't earn extra coin, it earned reputation. A bakery known for its clean, sacrificial bread free from ash or mishandling might find its name whispered among the temple priests, drawing more clients. In this way, Roman bakers fed both stomach and soul. Loaves for the dead. Bread was not just for the living. In Roman funerary tradition, it was customary to leave bread and wine at graves during commemorations. Some tombs even depict loaves carved in stone, as if to eternally provide for the deceased. Archaeologists have found real loaves preserved in the volcanic ash of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Most famously, at the house of the baker in Pompeii, several carbonized round loaves, panes quadrati, were found perfectly intact, still stamped, still split into 8 parts. These loaves, blackened but whole, became some of the most powerful symbols of daily Roman life, frozen at the moment of catastrophe. One wonders who baked them that night. Did they know Vesuvius would erupt the next morning? Or was it, like every other shift, just another night filled with flour and fire? The guilds, bakers organized for survival. As centuries passed, Rome's bread industry became increasingly formalized. By the late Empire, bakeries were bound into tightly regulated guilds, collegia pastorum. Membership in the guild could be hereditary. Bakers received privileges, like tax exemptions or grain quotas, but also obligations. Maintain a minimum output. Provide bread during public festivals. Respond to imperial requisitions during shortages. Guild members wore distinctive badges or seals, and often participated in local religious festivals as a body. Yet with the decline of imperial control, these bakeries faced a slow erosion. Grain supplies faltered, infrastructure decayed. The system that had once fed 1 million mouths began to falter. And still some bakeries endured. After the empire, the bakers who remained. As the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century CE, much of its bureaucracy disintegrated. The grain dole ended. Public granaries closed. The bakeries once supported by state grain became independent or vanished. But the knowledge, the dull, muscle memory knowledge of how to make bread in a city remained. In medieval Rome, bakeries re-emerged, often in the ruins of Roman buildings. Ovens were reconstructed, clay molds were reshaped, some even repurposed bricks from abandoned temples. And in many cases, Roman baking tools survived longer than the empire itself. Millstones continued to turn. Wooden stamps for loaf marking were handed down. ancient recipes remained embedded in oral traditions. Bread making became a quiet continuity of culture, bridging empire and early Christendom. The personal toll, what bakers carried. To speak of Roman bakers only in systems and ovens would be to miss the deeper weight of their trade. Bakers lived hard lives. Few grew wealthy. Many slept during daylight hours, separated from the rhythms of the city. Their children inhaled flour dust before they learned to read. Their shops were hot, crowded, and loud. Their names rarely entered history books. And yet their bread did. It was carved into tombstones, preserved in ash, etched in graffiti, painted on frescoes. Their work fed senators, soldiers, slaves, and emperors alike. In the imperial imagination, the baker was invisible yet absolutely essential, like water, like breath. The legacy in your hands. Now imagine this. You pull the final loaf from the oven. The crust crackles as it cools. You wipe your hands, close the oven's mouth, and glance at the wall where your father once etched a tally of his best bread days. It's not the end of a shift. It's a moment between worlds. In your small clay bowl sits the sourdough starter carefully fed each night, passed down for decades. A living thread of yeast that links your hands to those of your grandfather and his before him. And though your name may not be remembered, this loaf, this night, this memory of flour and fire will carry forward in the most ordinary of human actions, breaking bread. A final thought. Thousands of years later, in modern bakeries around the world, the same tools endure. Kneading troughs, stone ovens, early morning hours. In every warm, crusted loaf is the quiet ghost of a Roman baker. So the question lingers. What else in your life, mundane, repetitive, overlooked, might one day be remembered as the foundation of a civilization? Somewhere in the north of France, perhaps in Normandy, perhaps farther inland, sits a small, weathered abbey. Its name has faded from memory, its founding documents lost. Its cloisters now cradle more moss than monks. And yet, if you look closely at the stones, you can still see the faint signatures carved near the base of the nave. A bird, a star, a three-toothed rake. These weren't decorative marks. They were identifiers left by the stonecutters who built it. The abbey itself may have been forgotten, but the story of its construction survives in those quiet marks, an echo of the men who quarried, shaped, lifted, and placed thousands of stones by hand. This is their story. The medieval stonecutters, unseen architects. When you think of medieval France, your mind may turn to lords and castles, knights and feasts. But across the 11th and 12th centuries, as Christianity spread and monasticism flourished, Europe entered a slow, steady construction boom. Abbeys, priories, and churches rose like sandstone prayers across the countryside. These buildings were not conjured by clerics. They were built by manual laborers, men and sometimes boys, from nearby villages or faraway guilds, who worked season after season with chisels, hammers, and rope. Their job was not romantic. It was cold, repetitive, and physically exhausting. But in their rhythm, chip, tap, lift, a line, they shaped the very bones of medieval Europe. The stone, choice in quarrying. The construction of any stone abbey began long before the walls were raised. It started with the stone itself. In northern France, builders often used limestone, soft and workable, ideal for detailed carving. Sandstone, durable but coarser and heavier. Tuffle, a chalky limestone popular in the Loire Valley. The monastery's patrons, usually wealthy landowners or religious orders, would hire a master mason, who in turn scouted and selected the quarry. This might lie just a few kilometers away, or farther, requiring ox cart transport. At the quarry site, the hewers worked with iron tools, picks, wedges, and levers. They carved stones roughly into blocks and left the finer shaping for the masons back at the building site. It was grueling, dusty work. There were no goggles, no gloves, just stone, dust, and iron. And still, every stone was marked not with a name, but with a symbol. Mason's marks, the invisible signature. Why symbols? Because most stonecutters were illiterate. Letters meant little to them. Instead, each worker had a unique symbol: a triangle, a curling serpent, a hammer with crossed lines carved onto the stones they shaped. These marks served several purposes. Payment tracking. Masons were often paid by the number of stones they finished, not by the hour. Quality control. If a wall later collapsed, overseers could trace poor work back to its origin. Pride and record. Some marks were passed down through generations. You can still find these symbols today, tucked behind pillars, hidden under moss, etched faintly into stairwells. They whisper, "I was here. I built this." Daily life on the Abbey site. Imagine you are one of these stonecutters. You arrive before dawn. The air smells of damp grass and recently split wood. The Abbey walls rise slowly 2 stories so far, the cloister arches half formed. You and your fellow workers live in a temporary camp nearby, sleeping in straw-filled huts or rough lean-tos, cooking over open fires. A bell rings to start the day. You lift your mallet, take up your chisel, and begin. A day's rhythm. Morning matins bell to terse. Begin shaping stones from the delivered blocks. Some are for straight walls, others for curved arches. You listen for the right sound. A clean ping means your cut is good. A dull thud means you've cracked it wrong. Midday sext. Eat from a cloth pouch, usually rye bread, onion, a bit of cheese if you're lucky. Drink water or weak beer. Sit with your back to a half-built wall for shade. Afternoon nones to sunset. Continue setting stones into place with the help of pulleys, hoists, and scaffolds. Align with chalk lines. Listen to the maître d'œuvre, master builder, bark orders in Old French or Latin. Evening, clean your tools. Mark your finished stones, trade a joke or insult. Sharpen chisels, sleep early. Your body is sore every day. Your hands develop thick calluses. Your knees ache from lifting. But the wall grows inch by inch. And with it, your name unspoken takes shape in stone. Tools of the trade. The tools used by medieval stonecutters were simple but effective. Mallet massette, a short-handled wooden hammer with a rounded head. Point chisel, used for rough shaping and breaking stone. Tooth chisel grating, created smooth surfaces with parallel grooves. Flat chisel for finishing work. Plumb line and square, for checking angles and vertical alignment. Templates, wooden outlines for arch stones or window tracery. None of these tools were standardized. Most were hand-forged by local blacksmiths. A good chisel edge was guarded, carefully resharpened every few hours. And of course, the symbol stamp, hand-carved from metal or hard wood, was carried in a pouch, used with pride. Hierarchies and brotherhoods. Stonecutters did not work alone. They were part of a strict hierarchy. Apprentices, young boys, usually 12-14, learning to carry and clean tools, mix mortar, observe cuts. Journeymen, intermediate cutters, allowed to shape and place stone under supervision. Master masons, highly trained, sometimes literate, responsible for site planning, measurements, and final approvals. Though these workers rarely appeared in church records, they often formed fraternal groups, precursors to later Masonic guilds. Some traveled from site to site, migrating with the rhythm of cathedral and abbey construction, living as skilled nomads. Others remained local, building their own parish churches over a lifetime. They were rarely praised, and yet without them nothing would have stood. The stone that wasn't right. Every worker has a story of failure. A stone you thought was good suddenly splits mid-placement. An arch sags. A cornerstone lies a hair off level, throwing off the whole alignment. You remember one morning early winter, frost on the ground, you had shaped a keystone for a cloister arch. You carved your mark, a double chevron. The fit was tight. You were proud. But when the arch was raised, the capstone cracked. not from poor shape, but from a flaw in the stone's grain, invisible at the surface. The master said nothing, just looked at you, then walked away. You buried the cracked stone behind the wall, face down. No mark, no memory. And yet, you still think about it years later. An unfinished cloister. The abbey you helped build never achieved its full plans. A second cloister was proposed, but funds ran out. The tower was left half-height. The apse remains plain, unadorned by sculpture. The monks moved in anyway. You didn't stay long after that. Another site opened up downriver, more work, more bread, maybe more respect. You took your chisels and your mark with you. But on one stone, just one, you carved a variation. Your usual chevron, but with a tiny dot at the tip. Why? Maybe you were tired, or proud, or quietly hoping that one day someone might notice. Yet that raises a question, doesn't it? How many human lives, ordinary, dusty, aching, are still holding up the buildings we walk through today? The rising walls of the abbey are not yet smooth. Gaps remain. Mortar dries unevenly in places. From a distance it looks like progress, but up close you can see the imperfections. Still no one complains. The monks, clad in coarse wool, pass quietly among the scaffolding. They observe the work, murmuring in Latin. Sometimes they bring warm broth, sometimes nothing at all. You, the stonecutter, barely look up. You are focused on your work, a corner joint, rough cut yesterday, now being aligned with a newly shaped ashlar. It's not beautiful yet, but it is becoming. This section explores the relationship between the laborers and the monastic patrons, the logistics of medieval construction, and the slow, repetitive, deeply human process of building something meant to outlast you. Building with purpose, even if you're not invited inside. In many abbey projects, the men who built the walls were not allowed inside them once they were complete. Stonecutters, even the most skilled, were not monks. They didn't take vows. They didn't pray the hours. They slept in camps, cursed loudly, and drank ale. But they still understood the significance of what they built. It was hard not to. Every block lifted into place felt like a step towards something eternal. Even if no one remembered your name, the stones might. And so you labored with a kind of reverent indifference. Not for the prayers, not for the glory, just for the wall. The mortar masters. While the masons shaped and placed the stones, mortar mixing was its own critical task assigned to younger apprentices or dedicated laborers. Mortar was made from lime, burned from limestone in nearby kilns, sand sifted to remove pebbles, water hauled by bucket, sometimes from a stream kilometers away. The mixture had to be precise. Too wet and it would collapse under weight, too dry and it wouldn't bind. Mortar mixers developed a feel for it like bakers with dough. They used shovels, feet, even hands to blend it in large wooden tubs. And it had to be made fresh, every day, no exceptions. You can still smell it now, a tang of minerals and earth, thick in your nostrils even years later. Scaffolding and risk. The abbey rose slowly. With each course of stone, the scaffolding followed. Medieval scaffolding was made of wooden beams lashed together with rope or rawhide. Planks were set across to form narrow walkways. There were no guardrails, no safety harnesses. To lift stones, workers used block and tackle pulley systems with counterweights and manpower. Every lift was a risk. Stones could slip, ropes could fray. One misstep could send a man falling 2 stories down into the cloister garden. In winter, the planks froze. In summer, they baked under the sun. Most workers accepted the danger. There were no complaints, only the occasional cross drawn over the chest before stepping onto the next beam. The monks and the masons. Despite the social divide, the monks and masons coexisted. The monks watched the walls rise. The masons watched the monks kneel in prayer. Mutual respect developed quietly. At night, when work ceased, Some monks would bring warm broth or scraps of bread to the workers. Others would listen to stories. One monk, an old man named Gerard, bald and silent, would sometimes just sit near the fires, hands folded, eyes on the stars. The masons never asked why. They suspected he had once been one of them. The silent mathematics. There were no blueprints in the modern sense. The master mason carried most of the design in his head. Sketches were made on parchment or sometimes drawn with chalk on wooden planks. Proportions were guided by geometry, ratios, and a deep cultural memory of Roman and Carolingian forms. Apprentices learned by watching. How to find the true vertical with a plumb line. How to create a perfect semicircular arch using a wooden frame. How to space cloister columns evenly using only string and a span. Mistakes weren't just frowned upon, they were dangerous. One uneven base stone could compromise an entire wall. And so the math of the masons was not written but felt, measured in muscle, guided by instinct, confirmed in silence. Lunch on the wall. Work didn't stop for a formal lunch. Time was marked by the sun, the bells in your stomach. Each worker carried a small cloth satchel, or a wooden box sealed with beeswax, containing thick rye bread, often dense and sour, cured pork fat, sometimes mixed with herbs or garlic, onions or leeks, peeled and eaten raw, a chunk of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, a flask of watered wine or small beer. Food was eaten wherever you stood on scaffolding, beside a pile of bricks under a tree. There was little conversation, only chewing, then wiping hands on aprons and returning to the stones. Still, in those moments of stillness, you felt the wall breathing with you. The cloister arch, a team effort. One of the most complex pieces of the abbey was the cloister archway, not for its height, but for its precision. Arches required coordination. Voussoirs, the wedge-shaped stones, had to be cut at precise angles. The keystone must be shaped to exact thickness, or the arch would not hold. A wooden centering frame was built beneath, holding everything in place until the final stone was inserted. On the day your team raised the arch, the entire site paused. Sweat dripped as the final stone was slid into place. There was a collective inhale, and then silence. The frame held, the arch did not sag. A good sign. You scratched your mark into the underside of one voussoir, hidden from all but the birds and the occasional spider. The odd jobs and side tasks. Not every moment was about stone. When storms came, you mended scaffolding. When the kiln broke, you hauled wood to restart the lime fires. When the tools dulled, you walked to the blacksmith 3 villages over. When the friars needed help raising beams, you lifted and carried without pay. You were part of the abbey, but never truly inside it. Still, you shaped it with your hands, and over time with your body. Your back curved slightly from lifting, your shoulders grew dense, your fingers grew thick with bone, your face, lined with white dust, aged faster than it should have. And yet, you never saw your work as toil, only as building. When the bell fell, you remember it clearly. The monks had ordered a new bell, and it was hoisted up to the belfry one morning in late autumn. The ropes were tested, the scaffold prepared. But just before it reached the top, a strap snapped. The bell plunged not onto the ground, but onto the side wall of the transept. The impact crushed part of the corner. 2 months of work, 14 stones, gone in a blink. No one was hurt, miraculously. But the damage hung heavy. You stared at the broken wall, feeling it like a bruise in your chest. That night, the master mason didn't speak. He just placed his tools in the dirt and walked into the woods for an hour. When he returned, he lit the kiln again. The next morning, you began reshaping replacement stones. And no one mentioned the bell again. But perhaps you wonder, when the abbey was finished and the walls stood clean and white, what happened to the men who had built them? Did they stay, or walk away nameless, their work already crumbling behind them? The final stone was set without ceremony. No trumpet, no prayer, no feast, just a low grunt from the foreman, a nod from the master mason, and the slow sigh of wind curling around a half-finished bell tower. After 7 seasons of labor, the abbey was complete enough. The walls stood, the cloisters closed in tidy arcs, the nave was roofed in timber, the monks could move in, prayers could echo where hammers once did. And you, one of the many stonecutters, sat at the edge of the field with your tools in a bag, staring at the structure that had quietly devoured years of your life. It was finished, but no one would remember who placed the stones. When the work ends, completion for a medieval building was rarely total. The abbey's west wing remained rough stone. Plans for a bell tower spire were abandoned. Funds were thin. The local lord had moved his focus to building a manor house elsewhere. The monks blessed the walls. The scaffolding was torn down. And then the workers dispersed. Some went to other jobs: a bridge near the Rhone, a manor wall in Aquitaine, a church portal up the coast. Others returned to farming. A few, their bodies too worn to continue, faded into nearby villages. No record of their departure exists. Just stones with quiet marks, hidden beneath ivy and soot, still bearing witness. Tools down, hands worn. You packed your tools into a rough sack, your chisel tips dulled, your mallet split slightly at the handle. The cymbal stamp you used, the small double chevron, was smooth at the edges from overuse. You left it behind, buried beneath a stone at the far edge of the cloister. Why? Maybe because the wall didn't need more of you, or maybe because you didn't want to carry the weight anymore. No one asked you to stay, and that was fine. You didn't build the abbey to be remembered. You built it because it needed to be built. The monks take over. Once the walls were sealed and the masons gone, the monks took possession of the space. They filled the cloisters with herbs and silence. They slept on wooden planks in cold stone rooms. They sang psalms before dawn. They scrubbed the floors, patched the mortar, and lit candles before the crucifix. But few, if any, wondered about the calloused hands that shaped the arch above the altar, or carved the curve of the chapel door, or raised the stone basin in the garden. The labor was unseen. The walls were now sacred, and you, builder of that sacredness, were not invited inside. Generations later, whether and where. Decades passed. The walls held, mostly. Rain seeped through mortar joints. Frost split a foundation stone. Moss crept along the cloister. A lightning strike blackened the north transept. The monks patched what they could, but they were not masons. Their repairs were clumsy, pragmatic. Beauty faded under utility. The abbey changed hands in the 14th century, was attacked during a local conflict, partially burned, then repaired again by other hands. By the time of the French Revolution, the monks were gone. The abbey was secularized, parts of it sold for stone. The cloister's columns ended up in someone's orchard. And still some parts remained, especially the oldest ones. The ones you helped build. Rediscovery, a modern glance. Centuries later, a team of archaeologists clears the ivy from the nave. They're quiet, respectful. The lead researcher crouches near a low retaining wall and brushes away dirt. There it is, a faint double chevron symbol. She takes a photo, marks the spot in a notebook, then moves on. She won't know your name, she won't know your story. But she knows someone carved that mark 1,000 years ago, carefully, intentionally. She records it as Stonecutter's Mark, 12th century, unidentified. You are still unidentified, but not entirely forgotten. The hidden curriculum of stone. In shaping stone, you learned more than geometry. You learned how to endure, to shape the same angle again and again without boredom, to lift stones without snapping your back, to trust the man next to you on the scaffold with your life. You learned that legacy does not require a name, only work that holds. You understood that permanence is fragile, that even the strongest wall begins to erode the day it's finished. And yet, you still built it, because it was yours to build. What remains? Today, the abbey exists as a ruin. Tourists visit in spring, walking carefully along the surviving cloisters. They run their fingers along grooves in the stone, unaware that each groove was once shaped by a man, sweating in the sun, swatting flies, wondering about dinner. Birds nest where bells once rang. The roof is gone, the altar cracked. But the walls still stand, not because of prayers, but because of hands. A final thought. You may never see your own work last 1,000 years, but perhaps the effort, the quiet, daily shaping of something larger than yourself is the more enduring gift. So as you lay your tools down for the last time, one question remains. What are you building, slowly and invisibly, that might outlast even your name? The year is 1481. You're aboard a Portuguese caravel anchored off the Guinea coast near what is now Ghana. The sky is still black, the air sticky with sea salt and the distant hum of insects. The ship creaks faintly as it rocks in place. You are not a captain, not a navigator, just a sailor. Your shift starts soon. You rub your hands over a frayed length of hemp rope, listening to the soft clink of cargo chains. The others are asleep, some below deck, some wrapped in wool blankets on planks above. You wish you were too, but there is work to do. This story is not of conquest or naval battles. It is not about gold or glory. It is about what a Portuguese sailor actually did all day in the late 15th century, on one of the many, many voyages that history forgot to write about. The age of exploration and exhaustion. By the 1480s, Portuguese ships had been sailing down the coast of Africa for over 50 years. What started with cautious journeys past the Canary Islands and Cape Bojador had turned into a complex trade network. Portuguese forts like São Jorge de Mina, Elmina Castle, were being constructed. Ivory, gold, and human lives were exchanged for cloth, beads, iron tools, and liquor. But this exchange didn't happen in glorious showdowns or dramatic diplomacy. It happened in long, hot days of waiting, repairing sails, loading crates, boiling stew, scrubbing decks, and occasionally rowing in silence toward a humid shore. The caravel, small ship, big responsibilities. You serve aboard a caravel, a ship of 50 to 70 feet, with a narrow hull and 2 or 3 triangular lateen sails designed for maneuverability in shallow coastal waters. These were not grand vessels. They were efficient and crowded. As a sailor, your tasks rotated in a repeating cycle. Raising and trimming sails, reacting to the ever-changing winds. Coiling and checking rope, hundreds of feet, all prone to fray. Scrubbing decks to remove rot, salt, and vomit. Standing watch, usually 2 to 4 hours at a time, during which you stared into darkness and listened for trouble. Repairing rigging, always broken, always needed. Loading and unloading cargo, slow, backbreaking labor. You were part of a team of 20 to 30 men, packed into a vessel designed for maximum trade, not maximum comfort. Privacy didn't exist, neither did silence. Meals at sea, salt grains and guesswork. Breakfast, if you called it, that was usually cold. A typical day's rations might include hardtack tough, jaw-breaking sea biscuits, salted cod, bacalhau, or dried sardines, often soaked to soften, fava beans or chickpeas boiled, sometimes fermented unintentionally, dried fruits, raisins or figs when available, wine or watered vinegar to kill bacteria and boost morale, occasional garlic or onions, used both as food and medicine. Everything smelled faintly of brine, mildew, and wood smoke. You ate with your fingers, no plates, Food was passed in shared pails or bowls. Rats were constant company, so were flies. Water was stored in barrels and spoiled quickly. After 2 weeks, even the wine began to sour. Most men preferred it that way. Anchored off the coast. Being anchored off the coast didn't mean rest. It meant a different kind of work. While waiting for negotiations or permission to trade, you helped row the longboat to shore, 4 men rowing, one steering, sometimes with cargo, sometimes without. You loaded trade goods, iron knives, copper rings, coarse cloth, beads, or spirits. You unloaded cargo from shore, ivory tusks, gold dust sealed in reed tubes, dried animal skins. You waited, sometimes for hours, staring into the thick vegetation of the Guinea shoreline, wondering what lived behind those trees. At night you were told to sleep lightly. Storms came fast, and pirates faster. But mostly it was just hot. Talking to no one, listening to everyone. You didn't speak the languages of the people on shore. Most sailors didn't. A designated interpreter, usually someone who had lived or traded on the coast before, handled communication. But rumors were plentiful. That certain rivers carried gold right to the sea. That inland kings could turn cloth into iron. That the locals wore gold not for wealth, but to ward off spirits. You didn't know what to believe. Your shipmate swore he saw ghost lights dancing in the trees the night before. Another claimed the locals could shoot arrows with fire at the tip. In reality, you saw mostly trade, brief glances, bare chests, beads, hair done in rows, no fire arrows, just goods exchanged silently under the eyes of both greed and caution. But at night, the tailies grew bolder. Tall tailies on a flat deck. Evenings were your time. After stew had been ladled, sails furled, and decks scrubbed, the sailors sat in clumps, backs against barrels or curled in rope nests. And then came the stories. One man claimed he saw a giant fish with teeth like knives near Cape Verde. Another swore the locals had a city made of copper somewhere upriver where no ship could sail. A young deckhand said he'd met a man who could predict the winds by listening to palm leaves. You laughed, you doubted, but you listened. Because there was little else to do. And because somewhere, buried in the boredom, was truth. Heat, salt, and the smell of rope. Life aboard ship meant endless small discomforts. Salt rubbed into your skin from damp clothes. Rope burns on your palms. Insects, always insects, nesting in the thatch crates and biting in the night. The stink of bodies after weeks at sea. No fresh water to wash, only buckets of salt water which left you feeling no cleaner. You trimmed your beard with a dull knife, picked lice from your sleeves, slept with your boots on because you couldn't risk losing them. You watched the stars because they were the only things that didn't smell. The forts, São Jorge de Mina. When your ship finally made landfall at the new fortress São Jorge de Mina, still under construction, you saw a wall of stone and lime being raised by enslaved and paid African laborers, overseen by Portuguese engineers. The fort smelled of mortar and sweat. It bristled with tension. Soldiers patrolled the walls. Locals stood just beyond the perimeter. Trade was brisk but guarded. You helped carry crates of metal goods, liquor, and gunpowder into storage rooms. You slept under the eaves of the unfinished bastion. In the evenings, you stared at the jungle again, thicker now, less inviting. A priest blessed the quarters with incense. You saw rats watching from the stone walls. And as you turned in for another night on damp canvas, one question lingered. What were you really trading for? Gold, glory, or just one more week of food and pay before the mast broke again? The fort loomed like a misplaced stone tooth, whitewashed walls glaring under the equatorial sun, nestled between jungle and sea. São Jorge de Mina was still a work in progress. You could smell the lime in the mortar, the sweat of the masons, and the fish rotting in baskets near the docks. You, a low-ranking sailor from Lisbon, were now half laborer, half-guard and mostly confused as to why you hadn't sailed home yet. The days dragged, but that was the rhythm of Portuguese trading on the West African coast. Long waits punctuated by moments of frantic unloading, tense negotiations, and sudden storms. The shore leave that was. Shore leave implied rest, but there was no tavern, no quiet streets, just the unfinished fortress, filled with crates and cannonballs. Tents and lean-tos, housing soldiers, masons, and priests. Tropical rain, falling in great wet sheets, then vanishing like it never happened. Dense vegetation, steaming in the heat and alive with the cries of unseen birds and monkeys. You were allowed off the ship, but only to work. Once on land, you unloaded. Iron rods, hammered in Lisbon and rusting already. Textiles stiff and oddly patterned, meant for barter. Cheap beads, duller than you expected but apparently valued inland. Olive oil and vinegar, sealed tight and watched closely. Everything was accounted for, everything had a purpose, and none of it belonged to you. Trading at the edge. You were told not to speak directly to the African merchants. That job belonged to the linguist, a middleman who spoke some version of the coastal language, a few Portuguese words, and more than a little improvisation. You watched him work. Gold dust was weighed with care, never touched by hand. Ivory tusks were inspected for cracks, tapped gently. Cloth bolts were unfolded and sniffed for dampness. Cowries were counted, sorted, rejected, or accepted with nods. Sometimes a deal would collapse over a broken knife or the color of beads. Voices would rise. Weapons would be shown. Then, as quickly as it flared, calm would return. You never understood the full exchange. You just lifted the crates and carried them where you were told. Still, your ears were open. What you heard and what you didn't understand. You heard things. That inland traders were coming with salt and slaves. That another ship, farther down the coast, had disappeared after a storm. That some locals believed white men were spirits, immune to disease but terrified of fresh water. That mosquitoes tiny, whining things carried death in their bites. Some stories were believable. Others felt like the same tall tales you'd heard since leaving Lisbon. But stories were all you had in the long, slow hours between cargo lifts. The seasoned sailors gave warnings between puffs of pipe smoke. Don't drink the river water. Boil your rice. If your gums bleed, ask the priest for orange peel, if he has any left. You asked what orange peel was. They laughed, you didn't. The dead weight of waiting. Sailing ships rarely left port quickly. Once docked, the schedule became deliberately slow. Cargo lists had to be reviewed. Letters from Lisbon delivered and responded to. Ship repairs made with local timber, crude nails, and quiet prayers. Rain delays became excuses to stay still. Some of the crew were reassigned temporarily to the fort to help with construction. Others cleaned the ship. You did both. Every day was the same. Wake up before sunrise, clothes still damp, air already sticky. Work until the sun reached its peak, scrubbing, hauling, lifting, nailing. Rest in the shade if you could find any. Evening chores, coiling rope, swabbing deck, mending tiers and cloth. Eat, sleep, repeat. No one told you when the ship would leave. No one ever did. Sleeping in a world you didn't belong to. Nights were thick. You laid your sleeping mat on the lower deck or in the shade of a warehouse wall, using your coat as a pillow. The sounds never stopped. The drip of rainwater from canvas awnings. Cicadas shrill and constant. Distant drums, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes chaotic. The creaking of the ship, even when anchored. You didn't know the meaning of the drums. You asked once. Don't think about it, someone replied. It's not for us. So you tried not to, but you listened anyway. Small illnesses, quiet warnings. Sailors fell sick often. One with a fever that wouldn't break. another with bleeding gums and loose teeth scurvy, a third shaking at night, speaking in tongues before dying by dawn. The priest muttered prayers, the officer logged the deaths. The bodies were sometimes buried inland, sometimes not. You felt your own teeth with your tongue every morning, just to be sure. The fort's strange economy. Not all trade happened through official channels. Sailors bartered quietly with local vendors. Palm wine traded for scraps of copper or cloth. Dried fish or goat meat bought with trinkets. Strange powders sold as medicine or magic. The captain turned a blind eye unless someone got drunk or sick or both. Some sailors bragged about wives in every port, though most knew it was a lie, or worse. Others spoke reverently about a woman who gave them a charm, a bracelet, or a word of warning. Superstition was currency, too. You carved a small figure from driftwood and kept it in your bag. Just in case. The return ship that didn't come. Word spread that the next ship south from Lisbon had turned back storm damage, or pirates, or something else. That meant your ship would stay longer, until the next season of trade winds. The trade winds were everything. They were how you arrived, and how you would leave. They changed only twice a year, blowing southward in winter and northward in summer. Miss your window, and you waited months. So you stayed, and waited, and scratched new marks into the ship, railing each day just to keep track. And still you wondered, what happened to all the things you loaded? Where did the gold go once it left the coast? And would you ever see Lisbon again, or just the sea, forever rolling beneath your feet? The wind changed on a Wednesday. You didn't know at first, but the pilot did. He watched the way the sails fluttered, the angle of the seabird's wings, and declared it with the certainty of a priest reading omens. The trades are turning. It meant one thing, time to leave. But departure wasn't a simple matter of lifting anchor and catching the breeze. Not yet. You still had to finish repairs, load the last of the ivory, say goodbye to the fort, and write letters though you weren't sure who they would reach or when. You'd been on the coast for 3.5 months, long enough for the heat to feel normal, for the ship sent to become your own, for the waiting to feel endless. And now the end was near. Loading gold carefully. The final cargo included ivory tusks, bundles of animal hides, and a few sealed jars of gold dust double-wrapped in cloth and stored in locked chests bolted to the floor below deck. Gold was dangerous. Not because of theft, though that happened, but because it drew attention. Everyone watched when gold was moved. The captain tightened patrols. The sailors grew quiet. Even the fort's guards stood straighter. You helped secure the crates, hand over calloused hand, lifting them slowly through the hatch. A single slip could mean a jar cracking open and gold dust scattering through the bilge, never to be recovered. You'd heard stories about that. One ship, they said, took on a gold shipment so poorly packed that half of it leaked during the voyage. The crew scraped the planks for weeks, sifting through every sliver and knot. You hoped this ship would fare better. The final night ashore. That evening, the crew gathered on the sand just beyond the fort wall. Not a celebration, just something close. There was palm wine, sour and sweet, smoked fish, traded from a local vendor. A few men played simple rhythms on drums made of cargo crates. The fort captain allowed it, even nodded along. You didn't speak much. Just listened to the jungle behind you, dark and pulsing with noise. Mosquitoes buzzed at your ankles. The sky pressed down with humid stars. Someone sang a song about Lisbon. No one joined in. It was too far away to feel real. Still, for a moment, you felt something like calm. Departure, the crack of rope, the rush of wind. In the morning, you woke to the sound of shouting. Sails being hoisted, crates being shifted, the smell of burning pitch sealing the hull one last time. You took your place at the mainmast, pulled when told, coiled rope without speaking. The deck was slick with dew and sweat. The longboat was raised, oars still dripping, the gangplank withdrawn. The fort grew smaller with every lurch of the tide. No one waved goodbye. You watched as the shoreline blurred, the trees shrinking into a smudge of green behind the rising blue horizon. And then the full weight of wind in the sails. The return journey, less drama, more fatigue. Going home felt different. The sails held better than expected. The food tasted worse, what little was left of it. The water was brackish by the second week. The wine turned to vinegar by the third. The rats had multiplied. You slept whenever possible, took turns at the helm, scrubbed the deck, wrote in the margins of an old cargo manifest just to remember the days. A storm struck off Cape Verde. It wasn't violent, but enough to rip a sail and nearly pitch a crewman overboard. You caught him by the collar. Neither of you said much after. You just kept sailing. Landfall in Lisbon. When you saw the outline of Lisbon's towers, low, gray, and familiar, you felt something strange. Not joy, not relief, just strangeness. You had returned, but you weren't the same. The city smelled of garlic and horses. The docks were louder than you remembered, the air colder. Officials came aboard. The captain barked orders. The crew unloaded cargo, logged manifests, argued over shares and wages. You stood aside, rubbing the ridge of your palm where the rope had calloused it, watching others decide the worth of what you helped carry. Payment and dismissal. 2 days later, you were paid. Not in gold, in coin and credit, half now, half later, a bag with your name scrawled on it. Inside, worn reis, a chipped silver ring, and a half promise of more if you signed on again. You didn't ask for more. There was no point. You were free to go, or to sign up for another voyage. You chose the first. Walking the streets again. The streets of Lisbon felt smaller than you remembered. You bought bread with your new coins, rinsed your mouth with clean water, stared too long at a dog curled in the sun. You saw a woman selling oranges and wondered if the dried peel might have helped your shipmate with bleeding gums. It was too late to know. You slept indoors for the first time in 4 months. It felt wrong somehow, too still. The sea stayed in your ears, its rhythm, its silence, its vastness. You knew it wouldn't leave. What the records won't say. Your name was never written in any official log. You didn't lead a mutiny. You didn't discover a new land. You didn't make a fortune in gold or ivory. You were one of hundreds, maybe thousands, of nameless sailors who carried empire on their backs. One crate, one sail, one storm at a time. Your story is in the wear on the deck planks, in the knots you tied, in the rope burns on your hands, in the gold that reached the royal vaults carried by men who never touched it themselves. A final thought. History remembers captains, fortresses, and fortunes. But it forgets the man who boiled the beans, scrubbed the deck, and held the rudder steady during a squall. So as you stand on the dock one last time, the ship shrinking into the bay, ask yourself, is it enough to have simply held the line? To have sailed through salt and wind and returned changed, unseen, and whole? The royal court is alive with voices. Nobles whisper behind fans. Couriers arrive breathless from distant towns. Pages in velvet hurry across cold stone floors. Somewhere, a nobleman is arguing about land. Somewhere else, a bishop is murmuring about rights and penance. And you are still writing. You are a court scribe in the 13th century. You wear no sword. You command no troops. But you hold something far more dangerous in the court, a quill. This story is not about kings and wars. It's about what happens when history is not made, but recorded slowly, meticulously, and sometimes with ink-stained sleeves and sore knuckles. Let us begin behind the throne, in the quietest and perhaps most powerful seat in the castle. The court scribe, not a monk, not a clerk. In many medieval histories, Scribes are imagined as monks, writing in candle-lit scriptoria with one hand and holding prayer beads in the other. But you are not in a monastery. You are in a royal court. That makes you something else entirely. Part bureaucrat, trained in Latin and law. Part copyist, with the stamina of an ox. Part diplomat, translating royal whims into official charters. You were likely educated at a cathedral school, taught how to read, write, and memorize long passages without complaint. Your Latin is serviceable, your French is decent, your handwriting is very, very neat. You are invisible, indispensable, and entirely overworked. Your desk, the real seat of power. You sit at a small, creaking wooden desk. It leans slightly to the left. There's a splinter near the edge that's caught your sleeve more times than you can count. On your desk, a quill sharpened twice already today. An ink pot, sealed with beeswax to keep it from drying out. Scrap parchment for testing strokes. A knife not for defense, but for scraping away mistakes. A wax tablet for temporary notes and sums. You don't move quickly, but everything you do must be precise. A missing word in a land grant can cause a civil dispute. A miscopied name can disinherit a family. So you copy, double-check, and copy again. A day in ink and elbows. Your day begins early before the hall fills with noise. You arrive just after Laud's sunrise prayers and stay well past vespers. Your routine. Review new documents brought in by stewards, envoys, or the chancellor. Copy letters dictated by noblemen too impatient to wait. Transcribe charters using standardized legal Latin. Draft responses to bishops, abbots, and foreign courts. Maintain the registry, where every royal decree must be entered, dated, and indexed by hand. You eat quickly bread, cheese, maybe some cold stew at your desk. If you're lucky, no ink spills on the parchment. If you're unlucky, you spend an hour scraping off one misplaced line. The tools of tedium. You don't have pens. You have quill's goose feathers, trimmed with a small blade, hollowed to carry just enough ink to write a few words before needing a dip. Quills must be sharpened daily, held at the right angle, drawn with careful pressure, lest the ink blob or the tip snap. The ink itself is a mixture of iron salts, oak galls, and vinegar, a sour, staining liquid that smells faintly of rust. You make it yourself, in small batches, boiling it over a brazier and storing it in horn jars. Parchment is made from animal skin, mostly sheep or goat, scraped, stretched, and bleached. It's expensive. You never waste it. Your fingertips are always dry, your nails stained. Your thumb bears a callus from holding the edge of the parchment steady. Mistakes and margins. You do not cross out errors. That would dishonor the king. Instead, you scrape the ink away gently with a small knife. Smooth the spot with bone or wax. Write again, this time slower. Still, mistakes happen. Once you accidentally wrote Count of Flanders instead of Duke. The Duke noticed. You didn't sleep well for a week. Every document has margins for notes, edits, and corrections. But margins are also where you leave small marks for yourself. A symbol to remind you which parchment was too thin. A cross to show you where a scribe before you made the same error you almost repeated. The margins are your private map through a landscape of repetition. Politics in parchment. You are not a noble, but you know everything. You see the letters between lords. You transcribe the dowry agreements. You read the orders for taxes, the disputes over mill rights, the negotiations for troop levies. You are the first to know when a marriage has failed, a war has begun, or a favor has been revoked. But you tell no one. Loose talk can lead to dismissal or worse. You heard of a scribe who once joked about a duke's handwriting. He was reassigned to inventory grain stores in the outer provinces. You keep your head down. You write what they say. And you remember everything. Other scribes, other lives. You're not alone. In the Chancery Hall are a dozen others like you. Young scribes, still blotting ink and struggling to write in a straight line. Seasoned clerks, who can copy a papal bull without blinking. The chief notary, who signs everything last and speaks only in whispers. There's camaraderie, but not friendship. You borrow blades, share ink, trade tricks for copying seals. But when the bell tolls, each man returns to his own sheet of parchment, his own cramped script, his own quiet war with boredom. And then a pause. One day the court is quiet. The king is gone hunting, perhaps. The nobles are silent. No letters come. No visitors arrive. You sit at your desk, quill in hand, staring at a blank sheet. It's rare. It's strange. It's unsettling. And then the steward enters. An envoy from the papal court has arrived, he says. He places a sealed scroll before you. You reach for your knife. You prepare your ink. The quiet has ended. But it makes you wonder. Who writes the letters to the scribes? And when your hand fails, who remembers the ones who remembered everything? The wax seal cracks beneath your knife with a crisp snap. Red fragments fall to your desk like dried blood. Inside the rolled parchment is a letter from Rome, a papal envoy's hand, requesting translation, transcription, and duplication for court records. You're used to it by now, not the message but the process. And in truth, the contents of these high letters rarely surprise you anymore. They are full of veiled threats, flattery, requests for grain or gold, or judgments in matters of land and heresy. You stretch your fingers, you dip your quill, and with a sigh you begin again. When one word can cost a life. You've learned never to write in haste. In the courts of Europe, a misplaced modifier or an ambiguous clause can cause everything from a duel to a crusade. The king's peace must be written with precision. The terms of a marriage alliance cannot be left open to interpretation. A grain tax set in the wrong measure, modius or sextarius, might ignite a village riot. And so you write. Let it be known that the domain of Thornebrook shall pass unto Lord Ulrich, and his legal issue. Not heirs, not sons, not progeny. The exact legal phrase is required. Then you read it again, and again, and again. The sounds of the scriptorium. The room is quiet but not silent. You hear quills scratching in chorus across parchment. The soft huff of bellows, feeding the brazier where sealing wax warms. Occasional coughs, clearing throats parched from hours of reading aloud. The tap-tap of a knife, trimming another quill. The low voice of a junior scribe, muttering Latin conjugations under his breath. Sometimes an overseer will read aloud while others write in tandem. Item, that the lands of the deceased Sir Hugh shall revert to the crown. And 10 hands move in unison, copying the sentence like monks at prayer. You rarely speak during the day. Your voice becomes something reserved for errors, brief questions, or once in a long while, a dry joke. The words are not yours, but they pass through your hands like river water, constantly flowing. The ceremony of seals. At the end of each document, a seal is applied, the final gesture of legitimacy. You fetch the wax, you heat the spoon, you drip a careful pool at the document's base. Then you press the metal or wooden matrix, sometimes with the king's crest, sometimes a noble's signet, into the warm wax. You hold your breath every time. A seal too hot melts through the parchment, too cold and it won't take the impression. The seal is more than decoration. It is binding, enforceable, and sacred. Sometimes a rider gallops 100 miles with nothing but a sealed message, and it is enough to raise an army or spare a life. And you were the one who dripped the wax. Foreign words, familiar structures. You do not only write in Latin. Sometimes you must transcribe letters in French, the language of courtly diplomacy. Other days, you're asked to copy or translate texts in Middle English, Catalan, or Germanic dialects, if they are meant for trade or treaties. Latin remains the root, but the branches grow in all directions. You grow to recognize idioms. In the belly of the law, right arrow, a phrase indicating legal gray area. Under the king's hand, right arrow direct royal control. Without bell, book, or candle, right arrow a formal excommunication. These phrases have weight, and sometimes ambiguity. You pause when they appear, wondering whether the writer meant them literally or politically. You do not ask, you simply make a note in the margin just in case. The scribe's body. Your back aches. You shift in your wooden chair, worn smooth from long hours of use. There is no cushion. You sit with one foot slightly raised to support your wrist as you write. Your neck stiffens from constant leaning. Your hand cramps mid-stroke. Your thumb has ink stains that never quite wash off. You occasionally chew mint leaves to stay awake. If you're lucky, the steward brings spiced wine or ale in the afternoons. You wonder idly whether the chancellor's signature is heavier on days he's drunk. Memory without ownership. You remember documents you wrote 5 years ago, even 10. You recall the charter that granted a monastery exemption from taxes, the treaty that split a contested forest between two barons, the confession of a minor nobleman, dictated in haste before he faced execution. But your name appears on none of them. You are a scribe, not a signatory. You are trusted, but not credited. You are the servant of memory, but never its author. The scribe and the spy. There are rumors always. One scribe was dismissed for copying a treaty clause that had been secretly redacted. He was accused of leaking state secrets. They say he was flogged, then made to serve in the kitchens. Another scribe was caught writing poems in the margins, verses about love, or loss, or heresy. He vanished from court 2 days later. You don't write poetry. You don't gossip. You keep your thoughts tucked between your teeth and your eyes down on the page. But you wonder how many others are like you, scribes who know too much and say too little. A single day's legacy. Today you've written a land grant sealed by the Earl of March, a royal decree limiting the export of wool to Flanders, a charter renewing a monastery's water rights, 2 summonses to appear before the king's council, a reply to the papal nuncio expressing measured appreciation. By sunset, your fingers are stiff, your eyes bleary, and your desk cluttered with empty ink pots and discarded quills. And yet this may be the most important day in the kingdom. Nothing happens in court until it is written, and nothing survives history unless it is recorded. You stretch once, gingerly, and close the wax tablet that holds your shorthand notes. You leave the hall in silence. But as the candle gutters behind you, one thought remains. How many kingdoms lived and died simply because someone failed to write it down? The snow has started to fall light and dry, melting on the stone windowsill before it can gather. You sit at your desk, colder than usual, hunched beneath a wool shawl someone left behind last Lent. The castle is quiet. Winter has thinned the court. Nobles have returned to their manners. Messengers now come less frequently, bearing slush-covered scrolls wrapped in leather. The hearth burns in the great hall, but not in the scriptorium. Still, your work does not slow. The archive room, a forest of forgotten things. You've been asked to retrieve an old decree, a land dispute settled nearly 30 years ago between 2 lords who are both now dead. You take a lamp and descend into the archive room. It smells of dust and dried glue. The room is cramped with shelves, each filled with scrolls, bound codices, and bundles of parchment tied with hemp twine. Some scrolls are marked with wax seals long since crumbled into nothing. Each shelf is roughly sorted. Taxation records, marriages and dowries, land charters, ecclesiastical disputes, correspondence domestic and foreign. You run your fingers along one scroll and feel the ridge of a worm track. Some documents you copied yourself years ago. Your own hand stares back at you neater than it is now, younger, less hesitant. No one will remember you copied them. But there they are. Copying a death. This morning, a letter came from the marches. A noblewoman had passed Lady Alina of Hailburg. You are to copy her will into the official court record. It is 6 pages long, each line full of cautious phrasing. To my third son, Geoffrey, I leave the estate of Birch Hollow, conditional upon his fulfilling his oaths to the prior of St. Mary. To my maidservant, Magda, faithful these 23 years, I leave 1 silver goblet, unblemished, to be held in memory and not in use. You copy every word, every loop and ligature with care. The ink smudges only once, and you scrape it away like bark from a branch. By noon, her will is eternal. Her body will rot beneath stone. Her memory will fade. But your ink, your exact handwriting, will carry her final voice beyond the grave. The Queen Scribe. You've recently been given a new task, transcribing the private correspondence of the Queen. It is both honor and burden. You are now the silent vessel for letters that praise or scold distant nobles, plead with her brother the Duke of Aquitaine for peace, reprimand abbesses, confirm appointments of midwives and stewards. Most are dull, but one catches your attention. It begins plainly. To my husband, the king. You stop, you reread. The letter is unusually tender, filled with longing, apologies, and memories of a child who died last spring. This letter will never be sealed. It was never meant to be sent. And yet she asks you to transcribe it, to give her voice permanence, even in pain. You do not judge. You simply dip the quill and write. The scribe's apprentices. There are 2 boys now, apprenticing under the chief notary. They are 12 and 14. One chews his lip when he copies. The other has handwriting like a crushed beetle. You are told to teach them the correct hand. You set them lines to copy. Ad mandatum domini regis. Per nos et Herod's nostros. Scriptum est et testatum. They grumble, they make ink blots, they write too fast. You do not scold. You simply show them your own pages. And one of them, one day, will replace you. A rainy night. It is late and raining. You remain in the hall with only 2 candles, and the tap-tap of water dripping through a leak in the roof. Your task, to transcribe the court calendar for the coming Lent. This is not diplomacy, not war, just dates, names, feast days, anniversaries of decrees. You fill in. The Friday of the 3rd week of Lent, assembly at Norwich. The feast of St. Benedict, royal almsgiving. March 15, review of the wool tithes. The wax runs down the side of the candle. You yawn. And still you write. Because when the court meets in March, someone will look at the calendar and nod. And no one will think of you. Legacy measured in ink. One evening, the chancellor passes your desk. He glances at the charter. You're finishing one of 2 dozen this week. He does not stop to comment. He does not remember your name. But he says, almost to himself, they'll remember that decree in 30 years. Changed the boundary at Trosmere. You want to say, I remember writing the first petition. But you don't. You just nod and keep writing. The final record. You find yourself writing slower these days. Your knuckles hurt in the mornings. You squint more than you used to. But still you write. You write. Decrees that settle feuds. Letters that mend alliances. Laws that define generations. You even wrote last week the parchment that appointed your replacement. He doesn't know yet. But soon he will sit at your desk, just as you sat in another's shadow years ago. And the work will continue. A closing reflection. You are not a knight, you are not a lord. You wear no armor, you ride no steed. But you shaped kingdoms, word by word. You recorded who ruled, who died, who married, and who was spared. Your ink is the spine of the realm. Your hand, invisible, is the hand of memory itself. And as you place the final seal on your last parchment for the day, you wonder, when history remembers the king, will anyone remember who gave him voice? Before parchment, before law, before crowns and crusades, there was grain. Not battles, not politics, just wheat, rye, oats, and barley. These were the real empires of the medieval world, fields ruled by sunlight, rain, and aching backs, and their monarch, bread. You could not avoid it. Whether peasant or priest, knight or king, you ate bread. Coarse or fine, black or white, bitter or soft, it formed the base of almost every meal, not for luxury, for survival. And behind every loaf was a long, invisible process: the sowing, harvesting, thrashing, winnowing, milling, and baking. This is a story not of warriors, but of those who broke their backs for a daily crust. So step off the battlefield. Let us visit the thrashing floor, where history was built from dust and sweat. The bread equation. Bread was not just food. It was a measure of time, wealth, labor, and justice. Every village and town had its own rhythms. Sowing in spring, harvest in late summer, thrashing and winnowing in early fall, milling and baking throughout the year. It was not merely sustenance, it was currency. In some regions of Europe, wages were paid in bread or in grain. When a famine struck, the first question was not, "How many have died?" It was, "Are there loaves left in the oven?" And to reach those loaves, peasants had to pass through the grueling gateway of the thrashing floor. Welcome to the thrashing floor. Picture a broad, packed earth space, open to sun and wind. It sits at the edge of the village or just outside the barn. It's where the grain harvest, once cut and bundled, comes to be broken. Thrashing is the act of separating grain from chaff. Without it, your field is just grass. With it, you get bread. And how is it done? By flail. By hand. By endless, repetitive, rhythmic strikes. A flail is two sticks joined by leather or rope like a peasant's nunchaku. One shaft is held, the other swings. With every swing, the heads of grain are battered, loosened, split. Thump, thump, thump. Hour after hour. Each man or woman has a certain rhythm. Too hard and the grains are crushed. Too soft and they remain clinging to the husks. There is a skill to this monotony. A peasant might spend weeks in the thrashing season just hitting grain. And yet this boring labor feeds the entire kingdom. The smell of dust and husk. There is a smell to the thrashing floor. Dry dust kicked up by the flail. The bitter scent of crushed chaff. Damp from the early morning, dew soaking the bundles. Sweat your own and others. It cakes your skin, gets into your nostrils. By midday, your arms are numb. The rope burns your palms, you keep going. Children help, too, collecting stalks, gathering loosened kernels, tossing bundles from one pile to another. Old men offer advice no one asked for. And all the while, the wind waits, because wind is the final partner in this equation. Winnowing, the wind as worker. Once the grain is threshed, it must be winnowed. You lift the broken mass of grain and chaff in a shallow basket or blanket. You toss it into the air. The wind catches the light chaff and blows it aside. The heavier grains fall back down. It's a delicate dance. Too much wind and you lose good grain. Too little and the chaff remains. If there is no wind, you wait. If it rains, you curse. If you are lucky, you finish by twilight and gather the grain into sacks, the wealth of your winter. And if a single rat gets into that sack overnight, you may have just lost your week's work. The manor's share. The grain is not all yours. If you are a serf, a portion, sometimes more than half, goes to the manor lord. Another portion might be owed to the church. The rest, you divide between seed for next year and grain to be milled and eaten. Which means the loaf of bread on your table represents land tilled under obligation, seed purchased from last year's debt, work done in blazing heat with blistered hands, grain milled at a lord-controlled mill with a fee, baked in a communal oven also with a fee. You never eat for free. And if the harvest is bad, the bread gets thinner, the flour is stretched with bran, ground beans, acorns, bark, not because you want to, but because you must. Bread as law. In many towns, the size and price of a loaf of bread were strictly regulated. The assize of bread and ale, first issued in England in 1266, dictated that the price of a loaf must vary with the cost of grain, not with the whim of the baker. If a baker sold underweight bread, he might be fined, or pilloried in the town square, or paraded around with loaves tied to his neck. Bread was not just food, it was a legal measure of fairness. To sell bad bread was not just dishonest, it was a kind of treason. A note on bread quality. Not all bread was the same. The poor ate maslin, a mix of rye and barley, coarse and dark. The middling folk might afford wheat, but often with husks left in. The wealthy ate fine, white bread manchet made from well-sifted wheat flour. But even the best loaf would be considered dry and flavorless by modern standards. No yeast, no salt, no herbs, just flour, water, and labor. It was not eaten for pleasure. It was survival in a crust. And then silence. The thrashing season ends, the floor is cleared, the flails are hung, the wind is no longer needed. The grain is gone, stored in granaries, barrels, and sacks. The peasants return to mending fences, boiling acorns, cutting wood, hauling water. And you, standing on the now empty thrashing floor, feel the ache in your arms, the dryness in your throat. You wonder, not for the first time, how something so humble could rule your life. But then you ask yourself, if bread ruled the village, who ruled the bread? And how did those in power use grain to control lives beyond the field? Bread may have been born on the thrashing floor, but its journey to the table passed through power, policy, and privilege. The deeper you go into medieval society, the clearer it becomes. Who controlled the grain? Controlled the people. And it wasn't always the one swinging the flail. The grain lords. In manorial society, the lord of the manor claimed legal and economic rights over the production, processing, and sale of grain. This wasn't just about rent or taxes, it was about monopoly. The mill, the lord owned it. The oven, also his. The fields, even those you worked for yourself, were technically leased. Every step of the bread-making process passed through his fingers, and each passage involved a fee or a share. This system wasn't hidden. It was written into law, enforced by reeves, bailiffs, and manorial courts. Even your grinding stone at home might be illegal. If you were caught using a quern, a hand mill, you could be fined, or worse. The mill, where grain became power. Imagine the sound of the water mill, the rumble of the wheel turning, the clack of wooden gears, the sift of flour falling like dust. The local mill was not simply a utility, it was a checkpoint where your grain became food, and the lord took his due. The miller would weigh your grain, grind it with a portion taken, as told the mulcher, return the flour, usually with a little less than expected. Millers had a reputation, perhaps unfair, perhaps earned. They were seen as cheats, always taking more than their share. But more often than not, they were simply enforcers of the lord's rights. They were gatekeepers, you could not bypass them. Unless you wanted to risk everything. Resistance in the dough. and yet people did resist. Secretly, villagers hid quern stones beneath their floors, grinding grain by candlelight. Communal baking was sometimes done in hidden pits, avoiding the lord's oven tax. Groups of families might pool grain and sneak it to another manor's mill, under cover of darkness. These weren't revolts. They were acts of quiet desperation. If caught, punishments ranged from confiscation to public shame, in rare cases, imprisonment. But when a harvest failed, or when taxes rose too high, what choice was there? Bread and the church. The church, too, had a stake in grain. Monasteries were major landholders, and tithes were often paid in kind. This meant grain measured and weighed into sacks was brought to the priory doors. Some of it was used for monastic bread. Some was sold. Some was stored in vast, echoing granaries to be used in hard seasons. Monks tracked the rise and fall of wheat prices with almost sacred devotion. In some abbeys, the grain ledger was guarded like a relic. And when bread prices soared, the church sometimes intervened almsgiving, soup kitchens, or discounted loaves for the poor. But not always. There were hungry winters where monks ate well behind cloister walls, while villagers chewed bark and prayed. Urban bakers and the bread guilds. In towns and cities, things looked different, but bread was still central. Here, bakers were professionals. They worked in cramped backrooms with rising dough, hot ovens, and the ever-watchful eye of guild inspectors. The Guild of Bakers ensured proper weights and measures, fair prices tied to the assize of bread, training of apprentices, inspection of flour quality. A single underweight loaf could bring public censure. And yet bakers also had power. In times of famine, townspeople would rush bakeries, hopping to find even a crust. Bakers who withheld bread or raised prices might be attacked, looted, or worse. In 14th-century Paris, bakers were sometimes protected by armed guards during grain shortages. They were essential workers in the truest sense, but they lived in fear. The bread riots. Bread riots were among the most common forms of public unrest in medieval and early modern Europe. They were not chaotic. They were often targeted, organized, and even ritualistic. A typical riot might involve a crowd gathering at a baker's stall or mill, accusations of cheating or hoarding, seizure of bread or grain, marching through the streets, chanting prayers or slogans, demands for price regulation. Sometimes these actions were tolerated, seen as expressions of moral economy. Other times they were crushed violently. In the 1320s, towns in Flanders burned mills and sacked storehouses over rising bread prices. In England, bread riots flared after poor harvests in 1315–1317. Known as the Great Famine, these years saw millions die, not from war or plague, but from the absence of grain. Famine and the grain debt. When harvests failed, as they often did, the grain economy collapsed inward. Prices soared, loaves shrank, seeds were eaten instead of planted. Desperate peasants borrowed grain on credit from lords, moneylenders, or merchants. This was called grain debt, a promise to repay borrowed grain, or its value, with interest at the next harvest. But if the next harvest failed too, the debt doubled. Many became bonded laborers, working off their grain debts in what was essentially indentured servitude. Bread became not just survival, but a chain. And sometimes, people walked away from it all, fleeing their lands, leaving empty villages and seeking freedom in towns or forests. Loaf and law, the final word. To understand the medieval world, you must understand its bread law. It was baked into everything. Feudal contracts included grain obligations. Marriage agreements listed grain portions as dowries. Punishments for crimes often involved bread rations or deprivation. Holy days involved the breaking of blessed loaves. Bread sat at the crossroads of legality, morality, and survival. And always, behind every loaf, someone was counting. The bushels sown, the hands who threshed, the taxes owed, the flour taken as toll, the crumbs left behind. You sit now, a peasant or baker, perhaps a miller. You look at the loaf in your hand, coarse, cracked, slightly burnt on one side. You eat slowly. It tastes of work. It tastes of hierarchy. It tastes of memory. And yet, as you chew, you wonder. Why did those who worked the fields always hunger, while those in power, so far from the thrashing floor, dined without worry? Bread begins in the soil, is born in the fire, and ends in the gut. But its story doesn't stop there. Bread shaped how people lived, where they moved, what they feared, and what they hoped for. In many ways, the humble loaf became the foundation of European society, far beyond its daily consumption. This section explores how bread defined religion, ritual, migration, and even the imagination of a people trying to survive in a world ruled by weather, war, and wheat. The sacred loaf. To most, bread was nourishment. To the church, it was divine. In the Christian tradition, bread became the literal body of Christ during the Eucharist. This was not symbolic rhetoric, it was theological truth in medieval doctrine. The process of consecrating bread into the host involved pure wheat flour, meticulously prepared, baking by monks or nuns in sacred ovens, careful transportation in gold or silver vessels, storage in sanctified tabernacles. If a mouse touched the host, it was a sacrilege. If a drop of wine spilled, the very blood of Christ was seen as desecrated. Thus, one kind of bread fed the body. Another kind fed the soul. This division elevated wheat, especially fine, white wheat, to a symbol of purity. Poorer grains like rye and barley were seen as less holy, a marker of human fallenness. Even in theology, bread hierarchy persisted. The bread of death. Bread accompanied people in death as well as life. In some traditions, loaves were left with the dead either as offerings or to be distributed to the poor in their name. These were called soul loaves, dead cakes, breads of remembrance. They were eaten in silence, often during funerals, soaked in wine or herbs. The dead could not taste them, but those left behind consumed memory bite by bite. Migration by loaf. When grain failed and bread disappeared, people moved. Across Europe, waves of internal migration were driven not by politics, but by hunger. Families abandoned failing manors. Landless laborers sought work on distant estates. Whole villages disappeared from maps known only by the ruins of their bread ovens. And with each movement, they carried knowledge. How to build a simple flail. How to find the right wind for winnowing. How to stretch a loaf with pea flour or ground roots. Bread skills became migration tools, passed from parent to child, field to field. In this way, bread knowledge migrated across borders, long before armies or kings did. The loaf in the law books. Throughout the medieval period, bread kept appearing in court records. You'd find strange entries such as 1 John Baker, fined for selling a half loaf below weight, to stand in the square with spoiled crusts tied around his neck. Or, Marjorie Miller did unlawfully grind rye at night with a hidden quernstone, grain seized by the reeve and baked into alms bread. Even more mundane, legal contracts contained payment in X loaves per week, feudal obligation of 1 grain sack and 6 oven uses per year, disputes over whose goat had eaten the barley intended for holy bread. Bread was so ever-present that it required laws to manage its ordinariness. It was not a luxury to legislate, it was the default around which society revolved. The peasant imagination. it would be wrong to say peasants saw bread as only sustenance. In folklore and song, bread appeared as symbol, as hope, and as joke. A man dreams of a heaven where bread rains from the sky. A cautionary tale tells of a greedy baker punished by a talking loaf. Children are taught to always bless their crusts, lest they anger the bread saint. In some regions, there were bread feasts during festivals where children wore crust crowns, and loaves were decorated with faces and names. Even when starving, people sang about bread dreams, ideal meals filled with warmth and butter and jam, though the last two often didn't exist yet in their world. In these tales, bread was not merely food, it was aspiration. Innovations in the crust. By the late Middle Ages, new technologies slowly began to reshape bread. Rotary querns made hand milling faster, though still illegal in some manners. Water mills expanded production and reduced labor. Stone ovens became more widespread, improving baking consistency. And cities began experimenting with yeast-based leavening, imported from brewing techniques. Slowly, bread became softer, airier, and more flavorful, at least for those who could afford it. Still, most bread remained dense, dark, dry. But it was bread, and for most that was enough. The loaf and the ledger. Monasteries and estates kept detailed grain records, often stretching back decades or centuries. From these we learn average grain yields per acre, loaf weights and flour ratios, yearly patterns of feast and famine. In one 14th-century Cistercian monastery, the annual ledger records bread distributed to poor, 8,624 loaves. Bread consumed by monks, 21,991 loaves. Bread wasted, mice, spoilage, rot, 1,093 loaves. Even waste was measured because waste was sin, and bread was sacred. These ledgers became historical footprints, showing who was fed and who was forgotten. Bread as social mirror. Ultimately, bread revealed everything. Your loaf said who you were, what you owed, where you stood in the social order. A thick, dark slab, likely a serf or day laborer. A light, airy roll, a noble or wealthy merchant. A host on the tongue, a monk, a priest, or a soul in confession. Every crumb told a story. And in famine, breadlessness told the loudest tale of all. The last crust. In the cold of February, with stores low and the seed grain already counted, a peasant mother divides the last loaf between 4 children. She eats nothing. They chew slowly. She looks at the hearth and wonders if the spring harvest will come in time. She knows the bread has kept her family alive, just barely. And she knows if they survive, the flail will swing again, the wind will return, and the thrashing floor will echo with its dull rhythm once more. Life will begin again. With bread.